A week of urgent diplomacy to avert potential war. Officials from NATO and the U.S. have been holding talks with their Russian counterparts to pull both sides back from the brink of open conflict. But is anyone willing to budge? I'm Andrei Fedorov, and today's Newsmaker is de-escalating Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin says he has no intention of invading Ukraine, but Western officials aren't convinced. That's in large part due to the tens of thousands of troops Russia has amassed along Ukraine's eastern border. On Tuesday, those Russian forces conducted live-fire military exercises, adding urgency to a series of diplomatic efforts to defuse some of the most serious East-West tensions since the Cold War. But before we look at the challenges there, let's first look at the situation on the ground. Now, eastern Ukraine has been mired in conflict since 2014, when pro-Russian separatists took up arms to declare independent states in the Donbas region. The Ukrainian military has been fighting rebels there ever since. As a result, around 15,000 people have been killed and more than 1 million Ukrainians have been forced to flee. Well, this week started with intense talks in Geneva between Washington and Moscow. Those negotiations ended in a stalemate since both sides have red lines that are non-starters for the other. Now, Russia's key demand is that Ukraine never be allowed to join NATO. Moscow feels threatened by long-running Western efforts to bring Ukraine into its sphere of influence. But NATO says an open-door policy is central to the alliance and that it will never prevent any aspiring nation from joining. Now, those entrenched positions have clashed at Wednesday's meeting between NATO ambassadors and senior Russian officials in Brussels. Here's what NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg had to say.
Allies on their side reaffirmed NATO's open-door policy and the right for each nation to choose its own security arrangements. Allies made clear that they will not renounce their ability to protect and defend each other, including with presence of troops in the eastern part of the alliance. All this means that our dialogue is difficult, but even more necessary. NATO allies stress that they will make every effort to find a political way forward.
Well, unsurprisingly, Russia views the eastward expansion of a hostile military alliance as a direct provocation. And looking at the map, it has reason to be concerned. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization formed in 1949 with 12 original members comprised of the US, Canada, and most of Western Europe. Over the next 5 decades, just 4 countries joined the alliance. But today, NATO membership has doubled. The now 30 member states include former Warsaw Pact countries and ex-Yugoslav republics. And the declaration at the end of NATO's landmark Bucharest summit in 2008 was crystal clear. NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agree today that these countries will become members of NATO. And ever since then, and again this week, Russia has been adamant that that is unacceptable.
We've presented the logic and substantive parts of our proposals in detail to the Americans. We explained why obtaining legal assurances of NATO not expanding is an absolute imperative, why we need to obtain legal guarantees that weapons are not deployed near Russian borders that could strike targets on our territory. These are attempts to put forward an ultimatum. These are attempts of blackmail and intimidation. I understand that apart from sanctions and blackmail, little is left in the arsenal of modern Western foreign policy.
Meanwhile, the leader caught in the middle says he's ready to do whatever is necessary to end the conflict. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has suggested that he's open to implementing a ceasefire and agreeing to more prisoner swaps. Here's what his spokesperson said on Tuesday.
We can only welcome the intent and efforts of the United States and Russia, and NATO and Russia, to reduce tensions and resolve all mutual issues at the negotiating table. We have confidence in our partners and in their words that they will not make a single decision on the fate of Ukraine behind our back.
So, can diplomacy de-escalate? the situation? Well, here to discuss that and more, I'm joined from Moscow by Andrei Fedorov. He's Russia's former deputy foreign minister and a member of President Putin's advisory team. Dana Lewis joins us from London. He's a journalist and Russian affairs analyst. And completing our panel from Kiev is Peter Zalmayev, the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, it's been repeated now that neither side has entered these talks with any real sense of optimism. Both sides' red lines are really very steadfast. Peter Zalmayev, where does this leave Ukraine?
It leaves Ukraine hanging in complete uncertainty, in a state of suspense, where up until very recently, Ukrainian officials themselves have been very kind of complacent about the coming threat. And in fact, it is the Western security analysts and intelligence agencies that have been warning and ringing alarm bells about the impending, confrontation. So the only question is not if, but when and how much. But we're talking about Russia's invasion, because folks here are very skeptical that in these 3 rounds of negotiations that we're seeing in Geneva, in Vienna and Brussels, anything will be reached. Russia has put forward ultimatums which it knows and Putin knows are simply impossible for the West to satisfy, such as making a solemn pledge never to admit Ukraine. That's simply against NATO's open door policy. So it seems that Putin is preparing some kind of ground, some kind of a legitimation of coming offensive. And the only question is how much and how soon.
Peter, to what end, though, do you see this coming offensive? What does Russia want? To what, annex Donbass?
Vladimir Putin is playing, as usually, as is his wont, quite a complex chess game. I think there's several goals here. One is to further undermine the legitimacy and viability of NATO. Europe and the U.S. try to kind of drive a wedge in the Western resolve, but also to try to solidify his standing in the former Soviet space. Now that Kazakhstan asks for military help following unrest there, Vladimir Putin, wants to be seen as the protector of former, Soviet republics. He is very wary that he has not fulfilled his ultimate goal in Ukraine, and that is not outright annexation. It's not going to happen. He wants to keep Ukraine under its heel. He's tried to do it with the Donbass. He's tried to put Donbass back into Ukraine through Minsk agreements so that Donbass can block Ukraine from ever aspiring to join the West. And that's been a very, very kind of questionable outcome. He wants to make sure that Ukraine stays within its sphere of influence.
Okay. Andrei, I want to get your thoughts on what Peter's assessment was, especially the not if, but when Russia invades Ukraine.
It's a very difficult question because formally Russia doesn't want to invade Ukraine. The question is very simple. What will be the result of today's Brussels and tomorrow's Vienna meetings? Because the demand of Putin is very clear. Ukraine and Georgia should stay outside of NATO forever. And this is the main thing. Some other things we can bargain with Americans and even with NATO, but this is the most serious issue. And the problem is that already in the end of December, Putin mentioned that if there will be no proper answer to Russian demands, he will look for military and military technical answer. And in this case, the room for maneuvering will be very, very narrow, and anything might happen. Of course, it's very clear that Donbass area is the most hot one. And also Putin is using the argument that in Donbass area there are already 650,000 citizens with Russian passports. And there's a legal ground for Putin to protect them. So if there will be no result both in Brussels and in Vienna, Putin will have only last chance to speak again with Biden and to try to reach agreement him on only bilateral talks further on, with the hope that a U.S. decision will be the decisive and everyone will follow. I don't think that it might happen because NATO is different now, and NATO is not only U.S. soldiers, as we can say. NATO is much bigger than before. Okay. That's why our situation might turn quite dangerous, and it depends how far Russia might go.
Okay. Dana, you know, that Russian red line, that Ukraine and Georgia, for that matter, cannot join NATO, would any concessions ever be made on that front if it means avoiding war? Or would that just be seen as too much, something too close to appeasement?
No, Andrea, it wouldn't. I mean, there will not be any concessions on that. And that is very clear from the American president, from the head of NATO. And here's, you know, mix this into the soup, that the U.S. is not just running NATO. So you have 26 members. And that's chiefly why when some of these issues were raised by the Russians in their talks with the Americans said, well, they're not going to discuss this without NATO at the table. They're not going to discuss Ukraine without Ukraine at the table. So those NATO countries within NATO certainly have a lot of input now into deployment, into troop deployment, into membership, and into who the door is left open to. It is already unanimous, though, that we know they will not allow Russia to have a veto over membership of the NATO strategic alliance, which was largely set up to defend Europe from the Soviet Union. So, you know, there's no give there. But the fact that they're talking, I don't agree with the opening guest who says, you know, it's just a question of when Russia invades. The fact that they're talking is important right now because they have a lot to talk about. There are areas for compromise, and we can talk about that.
Dana, I just want to continue with you quickly, just to clarify, you know, to what extent you think NATO would or should go to, with the U.S. as well in the lead, to protect Ukraine.
Well, I don't think it doesn't matter what I think in terms of what they would do to protect Ukraine. But I think what is very clear from all of the Western leaders is that you cannot turn the clock back on independence and sovereignty of any European nation. And therefore, Russia's attempt now to claw away at Georgia or Kazakhstan or Ukraine, that is not going to be allowed to happen because it could lead to war in Europe. And so what they're saying is that, and Ukraine was given promises in the mid-1990s when it gave up its nuclear weapons after the fall of the Soviet Union, that it would never be attacked by Russia and Russia would respect the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. So I think what you're clearly seeing in red lines, never mind Putin's red lines here, but you're seeing clear red lines from NATO and from the Americans, and that is if Russia tries to invade Ukraine, that NATO will supply arms and more equipment and more assistance to Ukraine, and they will bring more troops to deploy in any of those Eastern European countries that are members of NATO. Now, that last point is negotiable in the sense that if Russia removes this gun to the head of Ukraine, then, Andrea, then I think you could have some discussion about military exercises by NATO on Russia's on the eastern flank. Okay. And then you can have very detailed discussions about arms negotiations and missile deployments.
Okay. You know, Dana, you alluded to Georgia in part. I'm going to, unfortunately, we've lost Andrei for the moment, and I want to come back to Peter then and take a bit of a leap forward, if I can, because I think it's relevant for our audience to understand what the dynamics in Ukraine are at present among the populace. Mm-hmm. Peter, what happens, for example, if the Ukrainian public, you know, in the next election in 2024, decides it doesn't like its Western-leaning leaders, along the lines of what happened in Georgia? You know, both Zelensky and Saakashvili won in landslide elections, but we watched, you know, much of the Georgian public kind of change its support for the West. Is that potentially what we could see in Ukraine at some point that we'll see there's too much antagonism toward Russia, and they don't like it.
Well, that's already been, that's been floated as far as like a potential scenario. And it's been proven time and again that Ukraine, courtesy of Vladimir Putin, by the way, starting in 2014, lost its affection, whatever affection it had remaining for Russia. Mr. Medvedchuk, who is now under criminal investigation, who is a politician with close ties to Vladimir Putin, he has not been able to grow much in popularity. His political force has really gone down quite a bit. And just like with NATO and with Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has demonstrated time and again a sort of a kind of a self-fulfilling, an ability to make self-fulfilling prophecies and voice self-fulfilling fears, such as the expansion of NATO. Well, why has NATO become more popular in countries like Ukraine? Why are Sweden and Finland, both of which have been neutral, considering joining NATO? Precisely because of Vladimir Putin's saber rattling. And the same thing with Ukraine. If 6 years, 7 years ago, before 2014, you asked me if that is a possibility, I would have said yes. Right now, it's a moot point to be considering this as a possibility. And let me just get back to the internal politics. I think what is happening right now and what is troubling, and I have to point out, is that Vladimir Zelensky is clearly flailing. He is not, it seems to me, taking the threat of Russia's invasion seriously. And meanwhile, he has begun a witch hunt against his political opponents in Ukraine, including President Poroshenko, the fifth president of Ukraine, whom the courts have now been investigating, have criminally charged. He's about to return from a foreign visit, and the rumor is that he will be arrested. That does not, increase confidence of Western allies in Ukrainian's government, and it is a very worrying sign that the current government is simply not prepared for a Russian invasion, diplomatically, militarily, or politically.
Okay, fair enough. Dana, let me come back to you quickly before I get back to Andrei, because, we heard Peter kind of drawing more parallels between Ukraine's position and Sweden and Finland rather than Ukraine and Georgia, which was the point I was making. I'm just wondering quickly where you stand on that, because many people around the world were very shocked. We have to remember that Russia occupied Georgian territory while a Western leader was in power, and the vote changed toward a more pro-Russia government. Could that not potentially happen in Ukraine? Or is there a completely different dynamic there, as Peter was saying?
I think the polling has shown that the vast majority of Ukrainians absolutely support independence and are turning away from and against their Russian neighbor because of 8 years of this war that has been going on in the East that is largely sponsored and driven by Russia, and some 14,000 Ukrainians are coming home in body bags and have been buried. And I don't think that you can blunt the effect that has had on Ukrainians who vow to fight, with Western support or not. There are a lot of angry people in Ukraine that believe that Russia's driving the conflict and won't allow it to settle, and that the address for all of this is President Putin in the Kremlin.
Let me turn to Andrei now, because I do want to get your thoughts on that. And let me specify with you, the fact that Sweden wants to strengthen its ties with NATO now, calling Russia's demands unacceptable, and Finland stressing it's their choice to join NATO and they will not be blackmailed. And I'm quoting the Prime Minister there. Doesn't that perhaps say something, though, about Russia's policy backfiring and actually pushing its own allies maybe too far?
For Russia, still the main issue, of course, is Ukraine. The main political task for Russia for a long-term period is to neutralize Ukraine from being in alliance. The question is very clear. Politically, Ukraine is lost for Russia. There is absolutely clear picture that there are no forces within Ukraine which can make a turn towards Russia again and to have a kind of friendly policy towards Russia. This is the reality, and in Kremlin it's very well understood. People understand in Moscow now that dealing with Ukraine should be in another way, not like it was before, when The idea was that there are strong forces inside Ukraine which can welcome Russia, etc., etc. And it's a fact that even in eastern Ukraine, the number of the people who are supporting Ukrainian membership in NATO raised very seriously. Concerning Finland and Sweden, okay, it's a long discussion. I know quite well both countries. And concerning Sweden, I don't think it will take a short time. It can be a very long story. Finland has already certain ties with NATO, with maneuvers, drills, etc. And politically, membership of Finland in NATO will be maybe even more shock than Ukraine, because traditionally Finland was considered as a very friendly, as a kind of best channel to influence on the Western policy in European Union, etc. But at the same time, there is a very clear understanding in Moscow now that all these steps and announcements which were made by Sweden and Finland are originated from crisis in Donbass, and originated from the current situation between Russia and Ukraine, because from each side there are more than 100,000 forces standing on the border. So that's why it's logic that many politicians, both in Sweden and Finland, are thinking about additional guarantees, though I'm 100% sure that Russia will never invade Finland.
Okay, Andrei, quickly, while I have you, I just need to ask you this. There might be some misunderstanding from especially those outside of Russia. So do you think people in the West, for example, might unfairly assume that everyone in the former Eastern Bloc states would, of course, want to be closer to the West, want to join NATO, join the European Union, when actually they have a much lower opinion of the West than what is realized from outside?
I think that there is a very clear understanding that number of former Soviet republics, as well as former Eastern Soviet Union satellites, they want to be in NATO, they want to join NATO, and this is the process which is very hard to stop. But the task of Russia, as I said, is to make everything what is possible. And the last demands, or ultimatum as it was called, this was an attempt to stop this process. And we will see soon if it will succeed or not. The biggest problem that if not, Russia really might turn from cool war into cold war. And it could be quite a dangerous development of situation. So we're trying to avoid it, but the recent results of Geneva and the beginning of discussions in Brussels shows that there are no mutual understanding on these key issues for Russia.
Dana, let me get your final thoughts.
I think that there's hope that they're talking, because if they start getting into the INF, for instance, and reviving the intermediate range forces, missile forces in Europe, treaties with Russia and NATO, if they discuss troop deployments and troop exercises and transparency, and try to come up with some kind of mechanism that the two sides can agree on, there is a room for Putin to step back and step down. If he's sincere in his belief that he's only really trying to defend Russia. If that's what it's about, then there's room for progress, and there is room to give the Kremlin comfort. If he is simply trying to dominate Ukraine and all of the former Soviet republics and bring them under his wing and upend NATO, then this takes us to yet another stair on the crisis ladder.
Okay. Peter, I can give you 30 seconds. Go ahead.
I'll just say that I agree with Dana that, once again, if Putin is, is sincere going into negotiations, then things may be worked out and allow him to save face after he really demanded things that are just simply impossible. But also, I think the West should not be kind of resting its case and waiting to see what happens. It needs to propose. It needs to actually offer Ukraine more serious guarantees. What it will do in case Russia invades, because Russia only understands force.
Okay, Peter Zalmayev, Dana Lewis, and Andrei Fedorov, thank you all so much for being with us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciated, and to our viewers as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.